What happens when a beloved country star walks into what should be a routine morning show appearance, only to find himself in the middle of a brewing controversy that nobody saw coming? Blake Shelton thought he was just stopping by the Today Show studio for another friendly chat with Jenna and the gang. But what unfolded next would leave everyone in the studio speechless and viewers at home glued to their screens. Before we dive into this explosive exchange, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because this story is about to get wild. The morning started like any other at the Today Show studios in New York City. Blake Shelton had rolled in around 7:30, coffee in hand, his usual easygoing demeanor on full display as he greeted the production team. He had been booked for a standard promotional segment talking about his latest album and upcoming tour dates. Nothing out of the ordinary, just another day in the life of one of country music's biggest stars making the media rounds, Jenna Bush. Hager was already in the studio, going over her notes with the producers when Blake walked in. She had interviewed him multiple times before, and their chemistry was always natural and fun. The audience loved seeing Blake's down-to-earth personality shine through, and Jenna had a knack for bringing out his humorous side. Today's segment was supposed to be no different, a light-hearted conversation about music, maybe some behind the scenes stories from The Voice, and of course plugging his new projects. But as Blake settled into the guest chair, adjusting his signature cowboy hat and testing his microphone, there was something different in the air. Jenna seemed a bit more tense than usual, her smile not quite reaching her eyes as she shuffled through her cards one more time. The producers were whispering among themselves in the corner, glancing occasionally at their phones with worried expressions. Blake noticed the shift immediately. He had been in this business long enough to read a room, and something was definitely off. The usual pre-show banter between him and Jenna felt forced, like they were both walking on eggshells for reasons he could not quite understand. "Everything all right over there, Jenna?" Blake asked, his Oklahoma drawl cutting through the tension as he leaned back in his chair. "You look like someone just told you that your dog ate your homework." Jenna forced a laugh, but it came out strained. "Oh, you know how it is, Blake. Just trying to make sure we cover everything today. We have a lot to talk about." The way she emphasized those last words made Blake's eyebrows raise slightly. In all his years of doing interviews, he had developed a sixth sense for when journalists had an agenda beyond the standard promotional questions. This felt like one of those moments. The stage manager called for places and the cameras began rolling. Jenna's on-air persona kicked in immediately, all bright smiles and professional warmth as she welcomed Blake to the show. The first few minutes went exactly as expected. Light conversation about his music, some friendly teasing about his coaching style on The Voice, and Blake sharing a funny story about his latest fishing trip back home in Oklahoma. But then Jenna's tone shifted, almost imperceptibly at first. "Blake, I want to talk about something a little more serious if that's okay with you." Blake's smile faltered just slightly, but he nodded. "Sure thing, Jenna. Fire away." "There have been some recent comments you made during a radio interview that have been getting a lot of attention online. Comments about the direction of country music and some of your fellow artists. Can you help us understand what you meant when you said that some newer artists are, quote, losing touch with what country music really means?" The question hit Blake like a cold splash of water. He had done dozens of radio interviews in the past few weeks, and while he remembered having strong opinions about the current state of country music, he could not recall saying anything that would warrant this kind of follow-up. His media-trained instincts kicked in, but underneath, he was genuinely confused. "Well, Jenna, I think there might be some context missing there," Blake said carefully, his voice taking on a slightly defensive edge. "I love seeing new artists come into country music and bring their own style to it. That's what keeps the genre alive and growing." But Jenna was not backing down. She had clearly done her homework, and there was something in her expression that suggested she was not going to let him off the hook with a diplomatic non-answer. "But you specifically mentioned that some artists are more focused on social media presence than actual songwriting. You said, and I'm quoting from the transcript here, that some of these new artists wouldn't know real country if it bit them in the behind. Those are pretty strong words, Blake. Blake felt his jaw tighten. He remembered the interview now, casual conversation with a radio host in Nashville where he had spoken candidly about his concerns regarding the commercialization of country music. But the way Jenna was presenting it made it sound like he had launched a personal attack on specific artists, which was definitely not his intention. "Hold on there, Jenna," Blake said, his voice carrying a warning tone that his fans had heard before when he was not happy about something. "I think you're taking some comments out of context and making them sound a lot more inflammatory than they actually were." The studio suddenly felt electric with tension. The producers behind the cameras were exchanging worried glances, and even the camera operators seemed to sense that this interview was veering into uncharted territory. Jenna, however, was not deterred. "I'm just reading from the transcript, Blake. These are your words. And since that interview aired, several artists have responded on social media, saying they feel like you were specifically targeting them. How do you respond to that?" Blake's famous temper, which he had worked hard to keep in check over the years, was starting to simmer just below the surface. The way Jenna was presenting the situation made it sound like he had deliberately gone after specific people, when in reality he had been speaking generally about industry trends. "You know what, Jenna?" Blake said, leaning forward in his chair, his voice dropping to a more serious register. "I've been doing this for over 20 years, and I've always tried to support young artists coming up in this business. If someone wants to take general comments about the industry and make them personal, that says more about them than it does about me." The tension in the studio was now palpable. What had started as a routine morning show segment was quickly turning into something much more confrontational, and neither Blake nor Jenna seemed willing to back down. Jenna could sense that she was walking into dangerous territory, but something was driving her to push harder than she normally would. Maybe it was the pressure from her producers to get a viral moment, or maybe she genuinely believed that Blake needed to be held accountable for his words. Either way, she was not about to let him deflect. "But Blake, when you have the platform that you have, don't you think you need to be more careful about how your words might be interpreted? You're not just another guy giving his opinion at the local bar. You're Blake Shelton. Your words carry weight." Blake's eyes flashed with something that made the cameraman instinctively zoom in slightly. The easygoing country boy persona was starting to crack, revealing the sharp businessman underneath who had navigated the cutthroat music industry for decades. "So now you're telling me how to use my platform?" Blake shot back, his voice rising, just enough to make everyone in the studio sit up straighter. "I've been using my platform to help launch careers and support other artists since before some of these people you're talking about were even thinking about picking up a guitar." The exchange was escalating quickly, and Jenna found herself in uncharted waters. She had interviewed politicians, celebrities, and controversial figures before, but Blake Shelton had always been one of the safe ones. The fact that he was pushing back this hard was both thrilling and terrifying from a television perspective. "I'm not telling you how to use your platform, Blake. I'm asking you to take responsibility for the impact your words have had. Do you think it's fair that newer artists now feel like they have to defend their authenticity because of comments you made?" Blake let out a laugh, but there was no humor in it. It was the kind of laugh that anyone who knew him well would recognize as a warning sign. "You know what's not fair, Jenna? What's not fair is having my words twisted and taken out of context to create drama where none existed. I was talking about the industry as a whole, about trends I've observed over 2 decades in this business. But surely you can understand how artists like—" Jenna glanced down at her notes. "Morgan Wade and Parker McCollum might have felt personally attacked when you questioned whether newer artists understand real country music. The mention of specific names was like throwing gasoline on a fire." Blake's face went from annoyed to genuinely angry in the span of a heartbeat. Those were both artists he actually respected, and the suggestion that he had personally gone after them was completely false. "Hold up right there," Blake said, his voice now carrying the full weight of his frustration. "I never mentioned those artists by name, and I would never attack them personally. Morgan Wade is incredibly talented, and Parker's got more authentic country in his little finger than half the industry. The fact that you're trying to create some kind of feud between me and artists I actually support is exactly what's wrong with media today." Jenna realized she might have overplayed her hand, but she was in too deep to back down now. The interview had taken on a life of its own, and stopping now would make her look weak. "I'm just trying to understand your perspective, Blake. When you say things like some artists wouldn't know real country if it bit them, how are people supposed to interpret that?" "They're supposed to use some common sense," Blake exploded, his carefully maintained media persona finally cracking completely. "I was talking about the formulaic, manufactured stuff that gets pushed through the system without any heart or soul behind it. I wasn't naming names or targeting individuals, but apparently that's too nuanced for today's clickbait culture." The studio had gone completely silent, except for the low hum of the cameras. Even the crew members who had seen their share of dramatic television moments were watching with wide eyes. This was not the Blake Shelton they were used to seeing on morning television. Jenna tried to regain control of the interview, but Blake was on a roll now. "You want to talk about responsibility? How about taking responsibility for turning a thoughtful conversation about the music industry into a manufactured controversy? How about being responsible enough to present the full context instead of cherry-picking quotes to create drama?" "Blake, I understand you're upset, but—" "Upset?" Blake interrupted, standing up from his chair and pulling off his microphone. "I'm not upset, Jenna. I'm disappointed. I'm disappointed that someone I considered a friend would ambush me like this. I'm disappointed that a show I've always enjoyed coming on has decided to prioritize sensationalism over honest journalism." The gesture of removing his microphone sent a clear message to everyone in the studio. This interview was over, whether the producers wanted it to be or not, but Jenna was not ready to let him walk away. "So you're just going to leave? You're going to storm off instead of having an adult conversation about this?" Blake stopped in his tracks, his hand already on the microphone pack clipped to his belt. For a moment it looked like he might keep walking, but then he turned back around, and the look in his eyes was something none of them had ever seen before. "An adult conversation?" he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "Jenna, an adult conversation would have involved you calling me or my team ahead of time and saying, 'Hey, there's been some reaction to comments you made. Can we talk about it?' An adult conversation wouldn't involve setting me up on live television and trying to make me look like some kind of bully who goes around attacking young artists." Jenna felt her cheeks flush red. She knew he had a point, but admitting it on live television would be professional suicide. "I'm just doing my job, Blake. Sometimes that means asking tough questions." "Your job?" Blake laughed again, that same humorless sound that had everyone on edge. "Your job used to be about informing people and having genuine conversations. Now apparently your job is creating viral moments and stirring up controversy for ratings. Well, congratulations, Jenna. You got your viral moment." The silence that followed was deafening. Blake stood there for a moment, looking around the studio, at the crew members who were all trying their best to look anywhere but at him. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every second of what was quickly becoming one of the most uncomfortable moments in morning television history. Finally, Blake shook his head and started walking toward the exit. "You know what the real tragedy is here? I actually had some interesting things to say about the new album, about working with some incredible up-and-coming artists, about a charity project I'm launching next month, but instead of talking about any of that, we wasted everyone's time creating fake drama." As he reached the edge of the set, Blake turned back one more time. "And for the record, Jenna, some of the most authentic country music I've heard in years has come from artists who are younger than my boots. But I guess that doesn't make for good television, does it?" The challenge in his voice was unmistakable. He was giving her one last chance to salvage this situation, to acknowledge that maybe she had pushed too hard, too fast. But Jenna was caught between her journalistic integrity and her television instincts, and she chose poorly. "Blake, wait!" Jenna called out, but her voice carried an edge that suggested she was not about to back down. "If you walk away now, don't you think that just proves you can't handle being questioned about your own words?" That was the final straw. Blake stopped dead in his tracks, his shoulders tensing as he slowly turned around. The look on his face was one that anyone who had ever been on the wrong side of an argument with him would recognize immediately. This was no longer about the interview or even about the controversial comments. This had become personal. "You want to talk about handling things, Jenna?" Blake said, his voice carrying a deadly calm that was somehow more intimidating than his earlier outburst. "Let's talk about how you're handling this interview. You invited me here under false pretenses, ambushed me without a context quotes, and now you're questioning my character when I call you out on it. That's not journalism, that's tabloid trash." The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just exploded. Everyone in the studio knew that Blake had just crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, calling a respected morning show host a tabloid. Journalist on live television was career suicide material, but Blake seemed beyond caring about the consequences. Jenna's professional composure finally cracked completely. "Tabloid trash? Blake, I've been doing this job for 15 years. I've covered wars, natural disasters, and presidential elections. Don't you dare sit there and lecture me about journalism." "Then act like a journalist instead of a gossip columnist," Blake fired back, his voice echoing through the studio. "A real journalist would have presented both sides of the story. A real journalist would have given me a chance to explain my position before trying to crucify me on national television." The conversation had devolved into something that was barely recognizable as an interview anymore. It was more like watching two people have a very public, very ugly argument, and the cameras were capturing every painful second of it. "You know what, Blake? Maybe the problem is not how I'm presenting your words. Maybe the problem is the words themselves. Maybe you need to own up to the fact that your comments were hurtful and divisive instead of blaming everyone else for how they were received." Blake stared at her for a long moment, and then something shifted in his expression. The anger was still there, but now it was mixed with something that looked almost like pity. "Jenna, I've known you for years. I've watched you grow as a journalist and as a person. I've always respected you and considered you a friend, but right now, you're acting like someone I don't even recognize. This is not you. This is not the person who used to ask thoughtful questions and actually listen to the answers." For the first time since the confrontation began, Jenna seemed to waver. There was something in Blake's voice, a genuine sadness that cut through all the anger and frustration that made her question whether she had pushed too far. "Blake, No, let me finish," he said, holding up his hand. "I don't know if this is coming from you, from your producers, or from some corporate mandate to create controversy, but this is not journalism. This is character assassination disguised as an interview, and I'm not going to sit here and participate in it." Blake unclipped his microphone pack and placed it gently on the coffee table between them. The gesture was somehow more final than when he had ripped it off earlier. This time, there was no anger behind it, just resignation. "I came here today excited to talk about music, about the incredible artists I've been working with, about a charity project that could help a lot of people. Instead, I got ambushed by someone I trusted. That's on me for not seeing it coming, but I'm not going to compound the mistake by staying." As Blake turned to leave for the final time, Jenna made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Blake, please, can we just reset and start over? We can talk about your new projects." Blake paused without turning around. "Jenna, some things you can't just reset. Some things, once they're said and done, change everything. This is one of those things." And with that, Blake Shelton walked off the Today Show set, leaving behind one of the most uncomfortable moments in morning television history. The cameras kept rolling for a few more seconds, capturing Jenna's shocked expression as she tried to process what had just happened. The aftermath in the studio was immediate and chaotic. Producers rushed onto the set, the segment was hastily cut to commercial, and within minutes, clips of the confrontation were already making their way onto social media. Blake's team was fielding calls from every major entertainment outlet, while the Today Show's publicity department went into full damage control mode. But perhaps the most telling moment came as Blake was leaving the building. A young production assistant, barely out of college, approached him nervously in the lobby. "Mr. Shelton? I just wanted to say that I heard the original radio interview." "You did? And I don't think you said anything wrong. I think what happened up there was really unfair." Blake looked at the young woman, and for the first time that morning, his expression softened. "Thanks, sweetheart. That means more than you know. Just remember, in this business, context is everything. Don't let anyone twist your words or your intentions." As Blake walked out into the New York morning, the full implications of what had just transpired were only beginning to sink in. The confrontation would be dissected and analyzed for weeks to come. But one thing was crystal clear. This was not how anyone involved had expected the morning to go. So what do you think really happened here? Was Blake right to call out what he saw as ambush journalism, or should he have handled the tough questions more diplomatically? Hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments below whether you think Blake was justified in walking off or if Jenna was just doing her job as a journalist.